Under the pale breath of the Vermont winter, the Parker home stood like a lantern in the dark. Snow pressed against the tall windows, the glass fogged with warmth from within, and the chimney poured its steady plume into the silent air. In the town's eyes, Henry and Margaret Parker were a blessing in human form. Each year, when the first frost bit through the shoes of the city's unwanted children, the Parkers opened their doors. Orphans arrived by train, shivering, clutching threadbare blankets, their faces drawn but hopeful. It was said that the Parkers' hearth never went cold, their pantry was never empty, and their hearts were never closed to a child in need. To the townsfolk, this was goodness in its purest form. But goodness here was a costume tailored to perfection. Beneath that warm light, there was something rehearsed in the Parkers' kindness. Henry's smile lingered a second too long, his gaze holding the children as if weighing them. Margaret's embrace was soft but fixed, her arms pressing with a strange precision, like she was testing the structure beneath their coats. In public, they were patient and gentle. In private, there was an order to everything they did. Each child placed in a particular room, each mealtime set to the minute, every personal item taken and stored in a locked chest for safekeeping. They said it kept things tidy. The truth was that it made the children interchangeable. The house itself seemed to know the rules. Its halls were narrow, forcing the children to walk in single file, doors shut with a muted heaviness that made sound vanish. The air carried a faint scent of lavender and iron, the first to soothe, the second to warn. The dining room table, long and narrow, had no head or foot, yet the Parkers always sat at opposite ends, eyes meeting over the bowed heads of their guests. Between them passed silent signals, a flick of a finger, a glance, and a subtle nod. They noticed every cough, every shiver, every hesitation. Beyond the warmth of the house, the woods loomed dark, still and watching. They wrapped around the Parker estate like a natural wall, their skeletal branches leaning over the snowdrifts. Children were told not to wander there, that deep snow could swallow them whole. It was a believable warning, especially when paired with the local folklore of wanderers who never returned. But the woods knew more than the tales told in town. In its deepest folds were impressions in the snow that did not melt as quickly as they should, and shallow depressions beneath old pines where the earth seemed oddly settled. The first week in the Parker home always followed the same rhythm. The children were given new clothes, simple wool, identical for each, and their city rags were burned in the stove under the guise of removing lice. Each night, Margaret would tuck them into their beds, pressing the covers snug around their shoulders, her touch deliberate and slow. Henry would make his rounds last, standing in each doorway for an uncomfortably long moment, watching their breathing. It was not affection. It was a kind of measuring, a quiet taking of inventory. The townspeople, when they visited, saw only wholesome order. They saw children with brushed hair, folded hands, and full plates. They didn't see how the children's voices lowered when the Parkers entered the room. They didn't notice that the laughter stopped in the exact second footsteps sounded in the hall. To the Parkers, charity was a stage, and the children were both the performance and the raw material for something else entirely. On the edges of town, where the train line disappeared into the forest, there were whispered questions. Why did none of last winter's children ever write letters back? The Parkers had their answers ready, explaining that each had been adopted by loving families out west, too far for return visits. They produced neat envelopes in careful handwriting, short notes thanking the Parkers for their kindness. The letters were convincing, though the townsfolk never noticed how similar the penmanship was from one to the next. In the cold light of the Vermont winter, the Parker home remained the picture of virtue. But virtue was only the curtain. Behind it, the stage was already set, and the first steps in a much darker ritual had been taken. The woods behind the house were patient, holding their secrets beneath the snow, waiting for the spring thaw to bring them to the surface again. The Parker home stood on a rise just beyond the last lamplit road, its frame heavy with snow, its windows glowing a steady amber against the winter night. To the casual eye, it was a picture of safety, the kind of place where frost-bitten hands would be thawed by the fire and every corner smelled faintly of bread. But the bones of the house told a different story. It was not built in the soft, open style of newer homes. Instead, its rooms were narrow and deep, its corridors angled in ways that made footsteps carry but voices fade. The ceilings pressed low in certain hallways, forcing anyone tall to bow slightly. A subtle, unspoken gesture of submission upon entering. The locals, when they visited, found these quirks charming, the work of a bygone carpenter with old-fashioned tastes. They did not see the hidden intention in every wall, every turn, every shadowed recess. The oil-lit parlor was the first space that greeted the orphans each winter. Its warmth was deliberate, meant to disarm, to strip away the sharp edges of caution. Chairs were placed in a half-circle facing the fire as though for conversation, but the arrangement allowed anyone seated to be watched from the doorway without turning a head. The wallpaper, a pale pattern of faded ivy, masked small cracks in the plaster, each repaired over the years in ways that left faint ridges. Lines that, if followed carefully, hinted at door frames once sealed shut. Beneath the parlor, the house sank into colder ground. The stone cellar was older than the rest of the home, its walls damp and uneven, the stones darkened with age and something else that did not wash away. The steps leading down were narrow and worn in the middle, as if carrying generations of heavy loads. In the far corner, a bricked arch framed a doorway that no longer opened, sealed with mortar rougher than the surrounding wall. Henry Parker often stood there alone, hand pressed against the cold stone, as if measuring the chill. It was said the house had been built over the foundation of a hunting lodge from the 1700s, but in truth its base was older still, shaped for purposes no one in town would dare imagine. The kitchen was wide but windowless, its walls lined with shelving that reached the ceiling. Everything was labeled: jars of preserves, sacks of flour, bundles of dried herbs. Margaret insisted on order, her hands moving with quiet exactness as she measured, chopped, and arranged. The chopping block bore deep grooves, each one stained darker than the wood, and the iron hooks above it hung empty during the day, but not always at night. The pantry door, innocuous to visitors, was locked from the outside. Upstairs, the bedrooms for the children were identical in size and shape, each with a narrow bed, a small dresser, and a single oil lamp on the nightstand. The windows opened only a few inches, the latches stiff with age. The floors, polished smooth, creaked in predictable places so that anyone moving in the dark could be tracked by ear. Above these rooms was the attic, accessible only by a steep ladder that folded into the ceiling. Few in town had seen it, but those who had spoke of a strange, sweet scent lingering in the air like flowers left too long in a vase. The architecture of the Parker estate was not born from chance. It was a machine disguised as a home, a series of channels and chambers designed to guide movement, to limit sight, and to hold sound. Every space had a purpose, even if that purpose was only known to the two who lived there. From the front porch to the sealed cellar door, the house carried the weight of intentions laid long before any of the current townsfolk were born. And as the wind pressed against its walls and the snow fell in thick, muffled layers, the house seemed to listen, waiting for the next winter's guest to fill its rooms again. The winter of 1892 settled over Vermont like a locked door, sealing the world in white silence. The train from Boston arrived late in the afternoon, its wheels grinding through the snow-dusted tracks, carrying the first 4 children of the season. They stepped onto the platform in thin coats and mismatched boots, their breaths breaking in the cold air, eyes wide at the emptiness around them. Henry Parker was waiting, tall and still, his gloved hands folded neatly in front of him. Margaret stood just behind, her face open and warm, the perfect image of motherly welcome. To the station master they looked like saviors. To the children they were safety promised in human form. The ride to the Parker home was quiet. The sleigh glided over frozen roads, the bells on the harness muffled beneath layers of snow. The children huddled together under a heavy wool blanket Margaret had brought, her arm draped gently over their shoulders. She spoke softly, asking each child's name, listening with an attentiveness that felt almost too exact. Henry kept his eyes on the road ahead, but his gaze would drift to the blanket, to the way their knees pressed together, to the rhythm of their breathing beneath the wool. By the time they reached the house, the sun had gone, and the windows glowed like lanterns in the dark. Inside, the warmth was immediate, almost overwhelming. The parlor fire roared, and the table in the dining room was already set with bread, stew, and mugs of steaming milk. The children ate hungrily, glancing now and then at the Parkers, unsure if such kindness could be real. Henry carved thick slices of bread for each, his hand steady, his knife moving in perfect measured strokes. Margaret refilled their bowls before they could ask. It was a feast, the kind none of them had seen in months. When the meal was over, Margaret gently took each child's threadbare coat, folding it with care before carrying it away. She told them she would see to its cleaning. They would never wear those coats again. That night, the children were shown to their rooms. Each was small but neatly arranged, the beds already turned down, the lamps trimmed low. Margaret tucked them in herself, smoothing the sheets so tightly around their bodies that movement was reduced to a narrow sway. She whispered that it was to keep them warm, to hold in the heat through the long winter nights. Henry followed behind, standing in each doorway for a long moment, watching their eyes adjust to the dim light. He did not speak. His silence was not absence, but presence, a deliberate one that filled the air. The first days passed in a rhythm that felt safe. The children were kept indoors because of the cold, spending mornings in the parlor and afternoons in the kitchen where Margaret taught them simple tasks. Shelling beans, sweeping floors, and folding linens. At first it seemed like kindness, giving them duties to make them feel useful. But the work was always done under her watch, with exact instructions that left no room for choice. Even their play was supervised, the toys brought from the cupboard only at certain hours and returned with the same care as sacred objects. Each night their freedom narrowed, the bedtime came earlier. The doors to the upstairs hallway were closed and latched from the outside. The windows, which had opened a few inches, were now locked. Henry said it was to keep out drafts. The children began to realize that no door in the house opened without a key or a hand from one of the Parkers. The warmth of the home became something else, not comfort but containment. The evenings when the snow outside pressed thick against the glass, Henry would read aloud from the family Bible in the parlor. The children sat in a row on the carpet, their backs straight, their hands folded. Margaret would stand behind them, resting a hand lightly on a shoulder or combing her fingers through a child's hair. To anyone watching, it was the portrait of a wholesome winter night. But beneath it ran a quiet discipline, an invisible tightening of strings that only the children could feel. By the end of the first week, their coats and personal belongings had vanished entirely. Their clothes were exchanged for plain wool garments, all the same muted color, their hair trimmed neatly, and their shoes replaced with soft-soled slippers that made little sound on the wooden floors. The Parker home was now their whole world, and the rules of that world were shifting slowly, without announcement, until it would no longer occur to them to expect anything different. Margaret Parker introduced the ritual on a night when the wind howled against the eaves and the frost formed thick, milky patterns on the bedroom windows. She called it a kindness, a way to keep the children safe from the terrors that sometimes crept into dreams. In her hands she carried a quilt unlike any they had seen before, thick and dark, its weight visible in the way it sagged over her arms. The outer layer was stitched with care, the fabric worn smooth and the threadwork delicate, as though it had been passed down for generations. But beneath that softness was something far heavier. Hidden within the layers, sewn into the seams, were thin strips of iron, each placed with precise spacing so the weight was evenly spread from one corner to the other. She said the iron kept away bad spirits. What it truly kept away was movement. The first time she used it, the children were hesitant, but Margaret's voice was gentle and convincing. She spread the quilt over the smallest child first, smoothing it from the shoulders down, pressing it into place with both palms. The weight was immediate, pinning the child into the mattress without forceful hands, a restraint so quiet it could be mistaken for comfort. The others watched, unsure whether this was a gift or a strange punishment. But Margaret smiled as she worked, humming softly, making it appear as natural as tucking in sheets. She moved from bed to bed, repeating the same careful placement, the same smoothing of fabric and the same hum. By the time she was done, the room was still, and the children lay like pressed flowers beneath glass. Henry approved of the ritual, though he did not take part. He would stand in the doorway, his eyes tracing the quilt's edges, noting how perfectly it conformed to each body. In the mornings, he would ask Margaret how they slept, and she would always answer with satisfaction, saying the house had been peaceful, and that not a sound had disturbed the night. She never mentioned how the quilt muffled the restless twitching of limbs, how it dampened the small cries that sometimes came from half-formed nightmares, or how it trained the children's bodies into stillness without a word of discipline spoken aloud. The weight did more than hold them down. Over nights and weeks, it began to teach them something deeper, that resistance was futile, that their bodies no longer belonged entirely to them after dark. Some learned to sleep without shifting, their minds adapting to the steady pressure. Others lay awake under the oppressive warmth, their eyes fixed on the ceiling, counting heartbeats until morning. The iron within the quilt absorbed their heat, pressing it back into their skin until the line between comfort and suffocation blurred. Margaret cared for the quilt as if it were a living thing. She never let it touch the floor, never folded it carelessly. She would carry it each day to the sunroom to air out, laying it flat and brushing it with a cloth. She inspected the seams for weakness, tightening stitches if any thread threatened to loosen. She spoke of keeping it strong so it could protect the children, but her hands worked with the precision of someone maintaining a tool they could not afford to lose. The quilt was not just bedding. It was part of the house's machinery, an extension of its quiet control. Over time, the children stopped questioning it. Like the locked doors and the timed meals, the quilt became part of their new reality. Margaret would lower the lamplight each night, hum the same low tune, and lay the weight over them. They knew it would hold them until morning. They knew she would check the edges to make sure no arm or leg could slip free. And they knew Henry would pause at each doorway afterward, his shadow stretching across the floor, his eyes lingering not on their faces but on the stillness of their bodies beneath the quilt's heavy embrace. Outside, the winter deepened, the snow swallowing the fences and paths until the Parker home seemed alone in a white ocean. Inside, the nights grew quieter, the breathing slower, and the line between safety and captivity eroded like ice under warm hands. The method of comfort had become habit, and habit had become law. From here, it would not take much for law to become something far darker. It began as something harmless on the surface, a quiet pastime for long winter evenings. Henry Parker would gather the children in the parlor after supper, the fire casting slow-moving shadows across the walls. And he would tell them a story. His voice was calm, his pacing deliberate, and his gaze swept from one face to the next to ensure every eye was fixed on him. The tales were simple at first, fables, bits of local history, lessons hidden in plain words. But there was a precision to the way he spoke, as if each syllable had been measured before it left his mouth. When the story ended, he would dismiss them with a warm smile, saying they had listened well. The next night, they learned the truth of the game. He would call them back into the parlor and instruct one child to repeat the story exactly as he had told it. Not just the events, but the order of sentences, the pauses, and even the inflection. A misplaced word was a mark against them. A forgotten detail meant failure. The others would sit in silence, their small bodies tense, watching the chosen child struggle under the weight of Henry's patient, unblinking attention. If the telling did not meet his standard, there was no raised voice, no visible anger. Only a slow nod and the quiet words that meant punishment. "We'll try again after you've had time to think." Time to think meant the cellar. The children would be led down the narrow, cold steps into the stone-walled room where the air was heavy and damp. There, the flicker of a single oil lamp revealed the walls lined with dozens of slates. Each one was covered in precise white etchings, the exact words of past stories written in the exact order Henry had spoken them. Some slates bore more than one version, stacked like layers of a ritual chant perfected over time. The handwriting was uniform, almost mechanical, and it was impossible to tell which lines belonged to which child. The cellar smelled of chalk and mildew, and the sound of their own breathing seemed too loud against the stone. In that room, the children were given a slate and chalk and told to practice until they could recite the story without flaw. There was no bed, only a narrow bench, and the cold seeped into their skin until their fingers stiffened around the chalk. Sometimes they would try to memorize by rhythm alone, tapping the bench to keep the pattern in their heads. Other times they would stare at the older slates, reading the work of those who had been there before, wondering what had happened to them when they got the story right. Henry believed the exercise purified the mind, stripped away the unnecessary noise of imagination, and left only discipline and obedience. To him, a child who could not retain his exact words was a child unfit for the order of the Parker home. He spoke of memory as if it were a kind of moral purity, and the cellar as a place where imperfection could be corrected. Margaret did not interfere. She would simply stand at the top of the steps when the child was brought back up, brushing the dust from their hair, saying softly that they would do better next time. Over the weeks, the game grew harder. The stories became longer and stranger, filled with dates, names, and obscure references that had no meaning to the children but had to be remembered all the same. Mistakes became more common, and the cellar grew familiar. The children learned to dread the moment when Henry's slow nod meant they would be walking down those steps again, past the cold stone, into the company of the silent, chalk-etched words of those who had come before them. The walls held their history, and in that history was the quiet truth that no one left the Parker home without first being broken into perfect recall. It was in this way that Henry's ritual of innocence worked. A game that was no game at all. A lesson that carved itself into the mind until obedience was instinct and error was unthinkable. And as the snow deepened outside and the nights grew longer, the cellar filled not only with the words of the past, but also with the stillness of children who were learning, piece by piece, to surrender their own voices. It happened in the 4th week of that winter, on a night when the snow outside fell so heavily it erased the world beyond the Parker property. The boy's name was Thomas, though the Parkers rarely used it. He had been quiet since arriving from Boston, small for his age, with pale eyes that seemed always half fixed on some faraway thought. In the parlor he listened more than he spoke, and in the cellar he learned the stories faster than most. But Henry noticed other things. The way Thomas's gaze sometimes wandered to the locked back door. The way his small hands tested the edges of the window frame upstairs. To Henry, these were not signs of curiosity, but of defiance waiting to grow. And defiance, no matter how small, was never allowed to take root. The official story, the one the town would hear later, was simple. Thomas had run away during the night, perhaps in search of his family, perhaps out of fear of the snowbound isolation. The Parkers would say they woke to find his bed empty and the front door ajar. They would speak of lanterns carried into the woods, of calling his name until their voices went hoarse. They would lower their eyes when the search turned up nothing, and they would accept the town's sympathy with grace. But in truth, Thomas never left the house. In the farthest corner of the root cellar stood a carved wooden tub, older than the house itself, its inside worn smooth by decades of use. The Parkers told visitors it had been used for cider pressing generations ago, though no one in town had ever seen it filled with apples. Its true purpose was known only to Henry and Margaret. On the night Thomas disappeared, Henry led him down the narrow steps, the lantern lights stretching their shadows across the damp stone walls. Margaret followed silently, carrying a small pitcher. The tub was already filled with water drawn from the well earlier that day, the surface dark and still, reflecting the flicker of the lantern like a black mirror. Thomas was told this was part of the winter discipline, a cleansing to make him stronger. At first, the water was merely cold, a shock that tightened his chest and made him gasp. Henry steadied him with one hand on his shoulder, speaking in the same calm tone he used for the memory games. The pitcher Margaret carried was filled with packed snow, which she dropped into the water piece by piece, each lump dissolving slowly, lowering the temperature until the air above the tub turned sharp and biting. The boy's shivering grew violent, his lips paling to a shade that matched the frost forming on the edge of the wooden rim. Henry watched closely, studying the way Thomas's breathing changed and how his small frame fought the weight of the cold. This was not rage or cruelty in his mind. It was refinement. He believed that silence and stillness could be trained into the body the way a craftsman shapes wood. That fear could be replaced with obedience if the body learned to surrender entirely. Margaret stood just behind him, her hands folded, her expression unreadable. She would add another handful of snow when Henry nodded, each time slowing the boy's movements further. When the shivering stopped, Henry leaned closer, listening for the faint, shallow breaths that came in uneven intervals. He did not remove Thomas from the water immediately. Instead, he let the stillness settle fully, as if the room itself needed to absorb the moment. Only when the boy's eyes lost their focus did Henry lift him out, wrapping him in the heavy iron-laced quilt, pressing the weight into his limbs as though sealing the cold inside him. By then, Thomas no longer made a sound. The next morning, his bed upstairs was neatly made, the pillow fluffed as though he had left on his own. The other children were told he had slipped away in the night, and the story was repeated with such precision that even the smallest among them began to believe it might be true. But in the root cellar, the tub remained, the water drained, and the wood was still damp with the memory of his final breaths. Henry called it necessary. Margaret called it mercy. And the house has always kept the truth pressed deep within its walls, waiting for the snow to fall again. Henry Parker's most unsettling invention came to life in the dead of that winter, after Thomas's disappearance had been neatly folded into the house's history. It began, like all his methods, under the veil of something virtuous. He called it angel training, a practice to help the children hear the voice of God without the corruption of worldly noise. In his mind, the modern world was too loud, filled with meaningless chatter, the clatter of useless thoughts, and the petty noises of human weakness. True purity, he believed, could only be found in silence so complete that the soul would have no choice but to listen inward. And in Henry's mind, the children were the perfect vessels for such a refinement. The preparations took place in the parlor after supper, the same space where the memory games had once seemed harmless. Henry laid out the tools on a folded white cloth, strips of black fabric for blindfolds, a small spool of thin fishing thread, a curved sewing needle polished to a soft gleam, and small pellets of pale beeswax, each no bigger than a fingernail. The children stood in a line before him, their slippers whispering against the floorboards as they shifted nervously. Margaret, seated in the corner, offered no comfort, her eyes fixed on her knitting as if the scene before her were nothing more than routine. The ritual began with the blindfold, tied snugly around each head so no sliver of light could pass through. Sight was the first distraction to be stripped away. Henry would adjust the fabric with care, smoothing it over the contours of the child's face, pressing the knot until it held firm. Then came the sewing, a process he described as gentle and necessary, though the children felt the sting with each pass of the needle. He used only the thinnest thread, pulling it through the soft skin at the corners of the lips with delicate precision. It was not meant to injure deeply, only to discourage speech, to seal the mouth in a way that made even a whisper impossible without pain. He called this step stilling the tongue. Once the mouths were bound, Henry would soften the pellets of beeswax between his fingers until they were warm enough to mold. He pressed them carefully into each ear canal, shaping them to block sound completely. The wax carried the faint scent of honey, a sweetness that clashed with its purpose. With each plug, the world outside the body faded, replaced by the rhythmic beat of the child's own pulse and the faint rush of their own breath beneath the blindfold. Within minutes they stood sealed from the three senses that tethered them most to the living world. Henry would guide them one by one to a row of wooden chairs placed evenly along the cellar wall. Each child's hands were folded neatly in their laps, their posture corrected with a light touch to the spine or shoulder. He told them they would sit until they felt the voice of God moving within them, and that the length of their stay depended on their willingness to listen. In truth, there was no measure of success. The time was determined by Henry's own fascination, by how long he wished to watch the gradual erosion of their resistance. The cellar's air was cold and damp, heavy enough to slow breathing. Hours passed with no change in position, the children sitting as if carved from stone, their muscles aching under the weight of stillness. Without sight, without speech, without sound, the mind drifted inward in uneven waves. Some wept silently, the tears soaking into the blindfold. Others drifted into a disoriented half-sleep, unsure of whether minutes or hours had passed. A few began to hum deep in their throats without meaning to, the vibrations reverberating through their skulls in the absence of all other sensation. Henry considered these hums signs of progress, the first stirrings of divine contact. When he finally decided the training was complete for the night, Henry would remove the wax first, letting the dim, echoing sounds of the cellar seep back into their ears. The blindfolds came next, the sudden return of light making their eyes sting. The stitches were cut last, the thin thread sliding from the skin with a faint pull. He would examine each mouth for signs of swelling, praising those whose lips remained closed even after the restraint was gone. Margaret would be waiting at the top of the stairs with cups of warm milk, her voice low and soothing as though they had endured something noble. The training was repeated often enough that the children began to anticipate it, their bodies tensing when Henry laid out the cloth with its silent tools. Over time, the sound deprivation left subtle marks. Their voices grew softer in daily speech. They startled less at sudden noises. They began to move in the house with an eerie quiet, their footsteps almost soundless on the wooden floors. Henry saw this as proof that his science was working, that he was reshaping them into vessels of obedience and purity. But the silence he cultivated was not the peace of angels. It was the silence of prey, the stillness of creatures who had learned that making noise invited harm. And in the Parker home, that was a lesson that would only deepen with each passing winter night. The attic was not part of the tour when visitors came to the Parker home. Few even knew there was one, the narrow ladder to it concealed behind a panel in the upstairs linen closet. The panel slid open with a soft groan revealing steep wooden rungs that disappeared into darkness. The air that drifted down from above was dry and faintly sweet, carrying the scent of aged paper and something harder to name, the preserved trace of people who had once been alive. This was the most private space in the house, the one Henry and Margaret never spoke of, the one neither of them would allow the children to see. They called it the collection room only between themselves, and even then their voices were low, almost reverent. The attic's floorboards were covered with a layer of coarse burlap muffling footsteps. Against the sloped walls stood rows of tall wooden boards, each fitted with small brass pins. Upon these boards, the Parkers displayed the possessions of every child who had ever stayed through a winter and never returned. There was a chilling precision to the arrangement. A pair of knitted mittens carefully flattened side by side, a ribbon smoothed straight and pinned at each end, and a folded drawing held in place by 4 tacks so the creases would never relax. Every object had a small ivory tag beneath it, marked with a name and a date written in Henry's small, exact handwriting, and beneath the date in softer ink the phrase, "Went to live with angels." The Parkers treated the room as a kind of shrine, though its purpose was far colder. Each item was chosen not because it held beauty, but because it had been close to the child in their final days. A thing that had soaked in their touch, their warmth, and their smallness. Henry believed these objects carried an imprint, a residue of the spirit that could be held on to. He thought of the room as a ledger of his work, a proof that the transformations he wrought upon the children were permanent. Margaret's relationship to the room was different. For her, it was about containment. She disliked the thought of anything escaping, not a hair ribbon, not a scrap of paper, because she felt each piece might otherwise carry away traces of the house's truth. When a new child arrived, Margaret would watch closely for the moment they produced something of their own. A scarf tucked at the bottom of a suitcase, a drawing made during a quiet hour, or a worn toy hidden in a coat pocket. She would note the object without comment, knowing that when the time came it would be taken, cleaned, and mounted on its board. Some children noticed when their things disappeared. Others were too frightened or too obedient to ask. Either way, the object would find its way into the attic, pinned under Henry's steady hands while Margaret recorded the date in the small ledger she kept locked in the parlor desk. The attic was kept in strict order. Henry dusted the boards weekly, wiping the brass pins until they gleamed. Margaret refreshed the ivory tags if the ink began to fade, ensuring each word remained crisp and legible. There was no dust on the objects themselves. The mittens remained as soft as the day they were taken, the ribbons unfrayed, and the pencil lines in the drawings still sharp. Even the smallest stains were preserved, a smudge of dirt on a cuff, a faint ring of food on the corner of a napkin, as though erasing them would lessen the power of the memory. On certain nights, after the children were asleep, Henry would climb the ladder alone and walk between the boards in silence. He would pause before a mitten or a drawing, staring at it until his breathing slowed to match some private rhythm. He did not speak aloud, but in his mind he would recall the child's voice, their face in the moments before the end, and the precise way they had looked when the last trace of resistance left them. Margaret visited less often, but when she did, she would stand near the center of the room and simply scan the boards as if taking attendance. She did not linger on any one item. Her gaze moved in slow arcs, and when she left, she always closed the panel behind her with a careful press, as though sealing a vault. The children downstairs never knew of the attic, but they sensed something about the house's upper reaches. They noticed how Henry's mood sometimes shifted after he disappeared for an hour at night, or how Margaret's hands smelled faintly of cedar after she folded their clothes. They did not know that their own possessions had already been marked for the boards, that the date beneath their names was a matter of when, not if. And above them, in that dry, still air, the collection grew in perfect, suffocating order. Each new addition another quiet proof that once you entered the Parker home, some part of you never truly left. By late February, the snow in town was piled higher than the fence rails, and the roads had narrowed to single lanes carved through frozen walls. The Parker home, sitting just beyond the last bend, glowed each night like a beacon. Its windows lit, its chimney breathing steady plumes into the dark. Yet the light had begun to feel different to those who saw it from the road. Too constant, too unwavering, as though whatever was happening inside did not belong to the rhythms of a normal home. The first whisper of suspicion began in the schoolhouse, when the teacher noted that none of last year's winter guests had returned to class that spring. At first it seemed an oversight, a matter of poor record-keeping, but as the days went on and no letters arrived, the quiet questions began to grow teeth. Parents of local children spoke softly over kitchen tables, remembering how the orphans who came to the Parkers each winter seemed to vanish by the thaw. Some recalled names, others faces, but none could say with certainty where the children had gone. It was Margaret who provided the answers. She would visit the post office with a small bundle of envelopes, each addressed in neat, slanted handwriting to the townsfolk who had shown the most curiosity. The letters inside claimed to be from the children themselves, full of bright descriptions of new homes in distant towns, Chicago, St. Louis, even as far as Kansas. They spoke of kind adoptive parents, larger bedrooms, warmer winters, and endless opportunities. There were no mistakes in spelling, no ink smudges, and no traces of the hesitant penmanship of a child. Every letter was flawless. Those who received them wanted to believe. The idea of the Parkers as saints was woven too tightly into the fabric of the town to be easily unwound. And yet, for those who read closely, something felt wrong. The tone was strangely formal, the sentences patterned in a way that seemed copied. Some noticed that the handwriting never varied, not in size, not in the tilt of the letters, not even in the pressure of the pen on the paper. The postmaster himself, a man not prone to gossip, remarked that all the envelopes appeared to have been sealed with the same hand. Still, suspicion in a small town is a fragile thing, quick to be smothered by politeness. When questioned, Margaret would laugh softly, as if charmed by the concern, and explain that she had helped the children compose their letters before they left. Knowing young writers often forgot to send news once they were busy in their new lives. Henry, when asked, would give a slow nod and say he understood how people might wonder, but that the truth was simple. The children had found better places, and no good could come from dwelling on what was past. The snow kept falling, and with it came a strange stillness in the way people spoke of the Parker home. The more they doubted, the less they said aloud. Those who tried to follow their questions to the edge of action, a visit to the home, a request to speak directly to the children before they left, found their resolve withering under Henry's measured stare. He had a way of looking at a man that made him feel he had already trespassed on something sacred, and few wished to carry that weight. Inside the Parker home, the children still there had no idea of the letters written in their names. They did not know their identities were already being smoothed into neat, identical lines of ink, their voices replaced with Henry's careful phrasing. What they did know was that the world beyond the snowdrifts seemed to be shrinking further away. Fewer visitors came by. The trips to town had stopped entirely. The fences around the property had vanished beneath the snow, and with them any visible line between where the world ended and the Parker domain began. The rumors never fully died, but they learned to hide. People spoke of them only at night behind closed doors, lowering their voices even when no one else was around. And in that silence, the Parkers thrived. The letters became their proof, their shield against prying eyes, each one a small work of forgery that rewrote the truth in clean, obedient script. In the minds of the townsfolk, doubt had been answered. In the Parker home, it had only been buried, deep, neat, and under their complete control. By the winter of 1901, the Parker home no longer held the same steady stream of children it once had. The townspeople still spoke kindly of Henry and Margaret in public, but the quiet unease that had grown over the years had thinned the line of orphans sent their way. That year, only 2 arrived. A boy of 9 named Samuel and a girl of 7 named Clara. Their small figures seemed swallowed by the vast echoing spaces of the house, and with so few to oversee, the Parkers' attention became more concentrated, more exacting. The rituals that had once stretched out slowly over weeks began almost immediately, each introduced with a sense of urgency, as though the clock of winter itself was ticking faster than before. Henry's rules were sharper now, stripped of the pretense of play. Meals were silent unless spoken to. The iron-laced quilt was brought out on the first night. The memory games were longer, the details more intricate, and the punishments for failure more severe. The seller saw them both within days, their small voices stumbling over dates and phrases until the cold stone and chalk dust became part of their breathing. Margaret's manner was still gentle, her voice still carrying that warm lilt, but there was a strain beneath it now, a need to draw the children deeper into the pattern before the thaw came. It was during that winter that Henry introduced the snow burial. He claimed it was an old northern cure, a way to strengthen the lungs and purify the breath, to clear the body of weakness. Samuel was the first to undergo it. On a morning when the sun was pale and the snow lay in deep windless drifts, Henry led him into the yard, while Clara watched from the parlor window. Henry had dug 2 shallow hollows in the snow just wide enough for a child's body. Samuel was made to lie down, his arms at his sides, his legs straight. Then Henry began to cover him, scooping snow over his chest, his stomach, and his legs, packing it gently but firmly until only his head remained above the surface. The cold seized Samuel's body instantly, his breath turning sharp and shallow. Henry crouched beside him, instructing him to breathe slowly and deeply, to let the pure air cleanse him. He timed each inhale and exhale, correcting the boy's rhythm with quiet authority. Clara's turn came the next day. She cried before they even reached the yard, but Margaret's hand on her shoulder kept her moving. The snow pressed against her body like stone, the weight building until her chest strained with each breath. The cold climbed her skin, finding its way into her bones until she felt the world narrow to nothing but the ring of pale sky above her and the sound of Henry's voice counting her breaths. Neither child was left in the snow for more than 15 minutes, but time stretched differently under that cold, each second an ache that burrowed deeper. When they were finally uncovered, their limbs were stiff, their lips blue, and they were carried inside, wrapped in blankets, before being laid beneath the iron-laced quilt to hold in the purity. The snow burial was repeated weekly. Henry spoke of progress, of their bodies becoming cleaner, stronger, and quieter. The children learned not to resist, their stillness in the snow growing more complete each time, their gasps for air fewer. Clara stopped crying during the burial after the 3rd week. Samuel's eyes no longer darted toward the house as if looking for rescue. They had learned the lesson Henry wanted, that their breath belonged not to them but to the ritual. Inside, the rest of the winter was an intensification of every method the Parkers had honed over the years. The cellar became a second home, the blindfolds and beeswax returning without warning, the collection room above filling with 2 new boards prepared in advance. Henry's movements were quicker now, less indulgent in the drawn-out patience he had once prized. Margaret kept the house in perfect order, but her hands moved with the same haste, as if they both feared the season would end before the work was done. The storms came heavy that year, locking the house in white silence for days at a time. When the drifts rose to the lower window panes, the Parker home felt like a sealed chamber cut off from the living world. Samuel and Clara moved through it like shadows, their faces pale, their voices faint from disuse. Outside, the snow smothered all sound, and inside, the Parkers' voices were the only ones that mattered. The final winter had become less about care and more about completion, as though Henry and Margaret were finishing a long, careful piece of work before spring could undo it. The world beyond the drifts did not know it yet, But the Parker home was entering the last season it would ever hold children. The thaw would come, and with it the weight of everything buried, in snow, in the cellar, and in silence, would begin to rise. When the first warmth of spring began to crack the ice along the river banks, the woods behind the Parker property stirred from their long, soundless winter. The snow was still deep in the shaded hollows, but in patches dark earth began to show through. It was in one of those exposed clearings that two hunters, moving quietly in search of early game, noticed the ground had sunk in a shape too deliberate to be natural. The soil there was softer, the thaw having loosened it faster than the rest. When the heel of one boot pressed down, the earth gave way in a damp crumble, releasing a faint scent that did not belong to the forest. They dug without speaking, using their hands at first, then a hunting knife to break the frozen crust. What they uncovered stopped them cold. Beneath the thin blanket of earth lay the bodies of two children, their faces pale but intact, the winter having preserved them in a terrible stillness. They were posed in exact symmetry, heads turned slightly inward toward each other, hands folded neatly over their chests as though in prayer. The clothing was clean, free of mud, as if they had been dressed after death. Across each closed eyelid was a black smear, a fine layer of soot painted with such care it followed the curve of the lashes without spilling onto the cheeks. The hunters stepped back, the woods pressing in around them, the cold air suddenly heavier. They searched further and found a second grave not far from the first, identical in shape and arrangement. In each, the same symmetry, the same folded hands, the same painted eyes. It was not the work of haste or fear. This was deliberate, ceremonial. Whoever had done it had moved with the precision of someone who believed the act itself was righteous. The hunters did not touch the bodies again. They marked the spot with broken branches and retraced their steps through the thawing woods, their breath quick and uneven. By nightfall, word reached the sheriff. A search party was assembled before dawn, their boots cutting a new path through the crust of snow, their eyes scanning the trees for more signs of disturbed ground. They found two more graves before the day was done. In each, the bodies were preserved by the cold and arranged with the same care. The hands were always folded. The eyes were always painted shut. And each time the scent of soot lingered faintly in the air, as though it had seeped into the soil itself. The Parker home was the first place the sheriff went. It was close enough to the graves that the walk between them could be done in less than an hour. Henry answered the door with his usual calm, his face unreadable as the sheriff explained why they were there. Margaret appeared moments later, her hands still dusted with flour from the kitchen. They invited the men inside as though the visit were nothing more than a social call. But the house, once warm and inviting to outsiders, felt colder now. Every surface seemed too clean, every room too quiet. The search began in the cellar. The stone walls, the narrow steps, the damp air, all of it seemed to hold its breath as the sheriff's men moved through. They found the carved wooden tub still damp in its seams, and the rows of slates with their careful white etchings. Upstairs, they opened closets and trunks, finding small garments folded too neatly to be in use. It was Margaret's locked desk in the parlor that yielded the first undeniable proof, a ledger, its pages listing names, dates, and short notations. Beneath each date was the phrase, "Went to live with angels," written in the same exacting hand. The most recent entries matched the descriptions of the children found in the graves. The attic was the final place they searched. When the panel in the linen closet was opened and the ladder lowered, the men climbed into the dry, still air above. The boards lined with mittens, ribbons, and drawings were enough to still even the most hardened among them. Each item was labeled with the same ivory tags, each tag carrying the date of departure. There were far more boards than anyone expected, more than the number of graves found so far. The attic was not just a hiding place. It was a record, a gallery of ownership. When Henry and Margaret were taken from the house, they did not resist. Henry walked with his hands folded in front of him, his expression almost serene. Margaret's gaze moved from face to face among the men as if memorizing them, her lips pressing into the faintest smile. Outside, the snow was melting fast, the first real warmth of the season seeping into the ground. But beneath that ground, in the still cold hollows of the forest, the rest of the Parkers' work waited to be found. Each grave holding its silent proof of a winter ritual that had gone on for far too long. The thaw would reveal them all, and with it the truth. The town had been too polite, too fearful to see. The trial began under the pale light of early summer, when the thaw had stripped the forest bare and the Parker graves had been counted, documented, and spoken of in whispers too raw to be printed in the papers. In the crowded courthouse, the smell of damp wood lingered in the air, a reminder of the long winter just past. Henry and Margaret Parker sat side by side at the defense table, their posture straight, their hands folded neatly in their laps, as if the proceedings were nothing more than a tedious formality. They did not fidget, they did not glance nervously toward the jury, and they did not speak unless spoken to. When they did, their voices were level, slow, and almost soothing. From the first day, they framed themselves not as criminals, but as chosen instruments of a higher order. Henry spoke of divine instructions, of whispers from beyond that had come to him during moments of great stillness. He described the children as innocents sent to be delivered, claiming his role had been to prepare them for the next life, free of the corruption and noise of the world. Margaret, in her turn, spoke softly of mercy, of protecting the children from the harsher cruelties of life by giving them the peace of angelhood before the world could stain them. They never once denied what had been found, not the cellar, not the attic, not the bodies in the woods. Instead, they tried to reshape the meaning, presenting their acts as sacred work misunderstood by those too earthbound to comprehend it. The prosecution brought out the photographs one by one. First the cellar, the carved wooden tub, the slates covered in perfect recitations, and the heavy quilt folded neatly on a bench. Then the attic, the rows of pinned mittens, the ribbons smoothed flat, the child's drawings held under brass pins, each tagged with its date and the words, "Went to live with angels." The images were stark, each detail caught in the frozen light of the camera, stripped of Parker's gentle explanations. Members of the jury averted their eyes when the photographs of the graves were shown. The symmetrical poses, the folded hands, and the soot-brushed eyelids. The silence in the room during those moments was heavy enough to make the tick of the wall clock seem loud. Witnesses came forward, the hunters who had found the first grave, the sheriff who had walked through the house, and the postmaster who had handled the letters supposedly written by the children. Their voices carried the restrained anger of people who had been deceived for years. Some spoke of small moments they now saw differently. The way the Parker children never played outside, the identical handwriting on every letter, and the locked doors. These details, once explained away by the town's trust in the couple, now seemed glaring. And yet not everyone turned against them. A handful of townsfolk, mostly older residents who had known the Parkers for decades, spoke in their defense. They recalled the winters when the Parkers had taken in children no one else would shelter, the warm meals they served, and the polite way they carried themselves. Some suggested the bodies in the woods had been victims of illness or the elements, buried with care rather than malice. Their words wavered between genuine belief and a need to protect the image of the town itself, as though condemning the Parkers outright would mean admitting that such evil had grown unnoticed in their midst. Throughout it all, Henry and Margaret never faltered. Henry's gaze was steady, meeting the eyes of jurors without challenge, as if certain they would eventually understand. Margaret's expression remained calm, even tender, as though she were listening to the confused ramblings of those who could not see the greater truth. When asked directly if they regretted their actions, Henry replied that regret was for those who had acted against God's will, and Margaret simply said that sorrow belonged to the living, not the delivered. The jury's horror was plain, but so too was the weight of the Parkers' composure. It was as if they had constructed an invisible wall between themselves and the accusations, one built from years of control, ritual, and the unwavering belief that what they had done was not only justified but necessary. The verdict, when it came, was met with a strange silence, a silence that felt less like resolution and more like the pause before a shadow moves. Even in judgment, the Parkers seemed untouched, their calm faces carrying the same unreadable certainty they had worn since the day of their arrest. And outside the courthouse, where the summer light was bright and the air smelled of grass, there were still a few voices in the crowd that murmured their defense, unwilling to let go of the image of kindness that had hidden the truth for so long. In the years that followed the trial, the name Parker became a cautionary whisper in Vermont's orphan care system. The outrage their crime stirred forced the state to move swiftly, drafting new laws that required every placement of an orphan to be registered, tracked, and confirmed through official visits. No child would be sent to a private home without oversight again, at least not on paper. Inspectors began visiting rural households unannounced, their clipboards and questions a visible reminder of the shadows left by the Parker winters. But laws, no matter how well-intentioned, could not bleach away the memory of what had been discovered in that snowbound home. For years, the people of town would lower their voices when passing the old property, as though raising them might stir something that still lingered there. The Parker estate stood empty for a time, its windows shuttered, its gardens left to choke under weeds. The white paint peeled away in curling strips, revealing the gray, weathered wood beneath. It might have remained a relic rotting in place had the state not decided to repurpose it. By 1905, it had been converted into a small asylum for the mentally unwell, the reasoning being that the building was already suited for confinement. The narrow hallways, the locked doors, and the secluded location all were seen as practical advantages. But the townsfolk muttered that the decision was more about cost than care, and that no matter how the state tried to dress it, the house had been built for control, not healing. Almost immediately, the staff began to share uneasy stories. Night orderlies reported hearing faint crying from the cellar long after the patients were asleep. The sound was not loud, but it was sharp enough to carry through the floorboards. A high, thin weeping that seemed to start and stop at irregular intervals like the breathless sobs of a child trying not to be heard. At first, the noise was blamed on patients waking in the night, but checks of the rooms always found them silent. The sound persisted through the years, sometimes going weeks without returning, then coming back stronger, as if the house itself were testing the new occupants' tolerance. Then there was the attic. When the asylum staff first moved in, they found the panel in the linen closet standing open, the ladder lowered as if waiting. But when they climbed up, the space was empty. Every board and every pinned object described in the trial was gone. The brass pins were still embedded in the wood, the outlines of long pinned fabrics faintly visible against the dust, but the items themselves had vanished. There was no record of their removal in the court's documents, no note in the sheriff's inventory, and no sign they had been taken for evidence. Some believed they had been destroyed, burned quietly to erase the worst of the memory. Others whispered that someone had removed them before the state could take possession, keeping the collection intact somewhere else. In the asylum's first year, a nurse claimed to have seen a child's mitten tucked high on a shelf in the locked storage room, though it was gone when she returned with another staff member. The patient spoke of the attic in odd ways. A few claimed they could hear footsteps above them at night, even though no one had access to the space. Others said they sometimes dreamed of walking between rows of boards covered in children's things, each object marked with a tag that bore their own names. The staff dismissed these accounts as the inventions of troubled minds, but the repetition of the details unsettled them. The attic was sealed after the first year, the ladder removed entirely, but that only seemed to deepen the unease. In town, the asylum's presence kept the Parker legacy alive in ways the state had not intended. People spoke of the house as cursed, though never in front of children. Those old enough to remember the trial carried an unspoken guilt, a knowledge that the Parkers' crimes had been allowed to stretch on because no one had wanted to look too closely. The new laws were meant to prevent such neglect, but the house stood as a reminder that vigilance often fades and that evil rarely announces itself in forms the world expects. When the property eventually changed hands again decades later, the transfer was quiet. The asylum closed, its remaining patients relocated to a larger facility. The state's report listed the building as structurally sound, fit for private ownership after minor renovations. But in the town, people still swore that on winter nights when the snow lay heavy against the windows and the wind pressed against the eaves, a faint sound could be heard in the distance. The thin, stifled crying of children carried from a place where the cold never truly lifted. Evil does not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it comes dressed in the language of kindness, its hands offering warmth while quietly taking something far more permanent. In the Parker home, it had worn the face of charity: hot meals in winter, beds for the unwanted, gentle words spoken in a tone that could soothe even the wary. The town saw only this surface because it was easier to believe in a good story than to dig for the truth that might sour it. Silence made that belief possible. The polite kind, the kind that keeps neighbors from asking the wrong questions, the kind that folds suspicion into a corner and tells itself it's none of its business. And under that silence, the Parkers built their rituals, one winter at a time. It was not the kind of evil that burned itself out quickly. It was slow, deliberate, and methodical. The kind that studies its surroundings, learns how to bend them, and then operates so seamlessly that it becomes part of the landscape. The Parkers didn't just hide behind innocence. They crafted it, perfected it. They understood the power of tradition in a small town, how reputations become armor, and how once people decide who you are, they will ignore anything that contradicts it. For years, the town's trust was their shield. Every letter they forged, every missing child explained away was accepted without challenge because no one wanted to be the first to speak ill of the couple who saved so many from the streets. There had been small moments, the details that looking back should have raised alarm. The children's absence from school, the way their belongings disappeared soon after they arrived, the fact that no one ever saw them playing outside, even on warmer days. But each of those details had been explained away in tones so reasonable, so polite, that pressing further would have seemed rude. And in a place where politeness was a kind of unspoken law, rudeness carried its own form of guilt. This was how evil remained, not by overpowering its surroundings, but by adapting so well that it became indistinguishable from the fabric of the community itself. The cellar and attic were not just rooms in a house. They were symbols of what silence allows to grow. Spaces where the truth could be hidden in plain sight because no one dared to look too closely. The rituals, the objects, the poses in the graves, all of it was a reflection of a mind that believed its work was sacred. And in a way, that was the most unsettling truth. The Parkers did not think of themselves as villains. They thought of themselves as keepers of order, as guardians who had the courage to do what others could not. That conviction made them steady. It made them calm in the face of accusation, and it made them dangerous far beyond the walls of their home. After the trial, after the laws changed and the house changed hands, the town tried to put the story away. They spoke of it less each year until it became something mentioned only in hushed tones or not at all. But forgetting is not the same as erasing. The outline of the Parker home still stood in memory, the image of its lit windows in the snow still vivid to those who had passed by on winter nights. The cries in the cellar that the asylum staff claimed to hear became part of the local folklore, as did the vanished attic collection. Some dismissed these as superstition. Others knew better. The truth is that the Parker story was not just about what happened inside one house. It was about the environment that allowed it, the mixture of trust, tradition, and unwillingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Those elements exist in every community in every time period. They are not unique to the Parkers, Vermont. That is why the story unsettles even after the details fade. It forces a question that no one likes to answer honestly. If such acts could unfold here in a place where everyone knew each other, where the watchfulness of a small town was supposed to keep its people safe, what would stop them from happening again? Perhaps the answer is vigilance, or perhaps it is something harder, the courage to risk politeness for truth, because evil does not always announce itself. Sometimes it smiles, holds out a hand, and offers shelter from the cold. And by the time you realize the cost, the snow has already closed in around you, and the silence is too deep to break.